Recording going? Good. To anyone watching this, do not play the Google memory game if you value your sanity. Right, so this workshop, incentives, capacity, and how to prove and weigh them. I'm just going to outline basically what the overall goals of the workshop are, and then we'll get going, and hopefully the structure will become fairly clear. But essentially, we're just going to go through this in 3 sections. So incentives, capacity, how to prove and weigh them. The plan is not to do motion practice today. We're going to integrate a few different exercises into this instead, and then we'll do a motion at the end, which hopefully will illustrate some of the learning points and gives you guys the opportunity to practice a bit of what we're doing in the exercises. So, first things first, this meme. Look at it, understand it, internalize it, adopt it into your practice. Okay, that's not a joke. This is the number one thing that I see that pisses me off as a judge. Quoting was like, opening assumed capacity, we're going to prove it, and then quoting does no work on incentives whatsoever, and you have 2 teams that have proven half an argument, and it's a nightmare. Anyway, right, a few general things and some bits and pieces. So, first of all, what are we not going to do at this workshop? I'm not going to introduce you to these concepts, because this is CT, not a workshop. I am not going to introduce you to how to use these ideas in debating. You all know that. If you want to prove something will happen, prove incentives, prove capacity. If someone else doesn't do both of those things, call them out on it, try to disprove the one that you've disproven. That's how rebuttal works. That is what we would do on a Monday in 20 seconds. I'm not going to teach you how to do this, because you all know how to do this, and this isn't going to be a macadamia workshop where I feed you important things and important factors to do about incentives and capacity. I'm also not going to talk a massive amount because I want the focus to be more so on the exercises that we're doing. So, what I'm going to do is just give a few general bits and pieces that I want you guys to bear in mind throughout this workshop, and then we're just going to get into it, starting by talking about incentives a little bit. So, first of all, some key general pointers. Right. First of all, just be really careful about stock. And this is the kind of thing that I noticed last week when I was judging the CT. But I think it's the thing that people do tend to suffer from, especially as you get more experience. At the point where you've heard an argument a dozen times, people just have a habit of saying things without really explaining them, without really thinking about them. And what that means is you've said a thing that worked in that one debate that you did it in 2 years ago when you first ran this argument and you were told it was great. But then as you've gone from running it in 2 minutes to running it in 10 seconds, somewhere in the 110 seconds that you've lost something important. And so just when you're explaining incentives and capacity, you make sure that you're actually explaining them, because a lot of the times people will just see these as quick things that they need to get through and little points that they need to tick off the list, and so they'll just say some things and that'll be it, and they haven't actually proven anything. And that can get quite challenging to judge and also quite easy to weigh over or rebut. This is another thing. Try to be reasonable and realistic in what you're proving, because sometimes it's very nice as a team, especially in closing, to think, we're going to prove something completely insane. We recognize that this is insane, but we're going to prove it because we can, because we're good debaters. And sometimes that pays off, especially in closing. But also, especially in opening, be cautious around those things. Generally, if you're framing as something realistic, and you're framing as something that actually links into the motion and how it applies in the real world, that's the kind of thing that leads all the other teams to be like, yeah, we agree with OG's framing, and we think the OO and CG are trash, and so we're going to engage in the long diagonal. And that's how you stay relevant throughout the debate, is just by giving the framing that everyone's going to think of later on and doing the stuff that's going to be considered smart, essentially, and reasonable. Along those lines, I think the best way to think about proving incentives and capacity is not just to think, what are the things that I'm going to prove and then how can I prove them, but think, what are the ways in which I'm going to prove things? What things is that going to take me to? What I mean by this basically is the way that I generally approach prep time in my head, like silent prep time, is I just think, what are the smartest bits of framing that I can come up with on this motion? What are the conclusions I can draw from that? How can I formulate that into arguments for whatever side I'm on? And I think that often works a little bit better, because what that means is you find the bits of framing that you're not going to necessarily disagree with the other side on, you're just going to be correct. If you disagree, you're right. If you don't disagree, then they've wasted a bunch of time proving something that you're just going to agree with anyway. And it means that you're generally going to be a lot more robust. You're saying things that the judges are going to nod and think, yeah, that's true. And you get to be the team in the debate where the judges are nodding, thinking, I can't believe no one said this already, but now they're saying it, and that's great. And this is one that we're going to talk a little bit more later, but be aware generally of the limitations of the conclusions that you can draw from your premises. Again, the differing extents to which you prove something will affect the strength of the conclusions that you can draw from them. So, the other general thing that I want to talk about briefly is how you can generally be realistic about specking things and the extent to which you can bring in spec knowledge. Because very often a lot of these debates where incentives and capacity become important are things like IR debates or law debates or debates about economic institutions. So any of the numerous Euros motions on China come to mind. The recent Ed Cup one about the Chinese banking sector comes to mind. And you're thinking what the intentions of different actors are and how you can improve capacity of different things. What I would say in terms of bringing in spec is if you want to do this, you can generally get away with a lot more than most people tend to think they can. It's just about how you do it. So, notice, and this is the key problem that we have to try and solve here, sometimes the world doesn't make sense. And sometimes you cannot explain a thing that is true in the world without bringing in spec, because there are no real structural reasons that you can think of, and all the structural reasons are based on other spec, and then that spec goes back thousands and thousands of years, and you can't explain that in 7 minutes. And so that's the core issue with all this, right, is no matter how good you get at proving centers of capacity, sometimes there's only so far that you can go in terms of explaining how something actually works in the real world. And if you can't do anything about it and just sat there on the bench thinking I'm right, but I don't know how to explain that I'm right without getting accused of spec dumping. So, trying to make it make sense as much as possible, you can usually go back and refer to some structural reasons, and sometimes those structural reasons link into other spec. But if you embed the spec within structural reasons, judges are generally quite a lot more lenient than if you just say a thing and move on. Arguably they shouldn't be, because if your structural reasons are all also based on spec, then that's the same problem, but they will often just forgive you anyway. You can take advantage of that. But you can also get away with more spec than you think you can if you do these basic things. So, thing one, go read the judging manual sometime. I know that a lot of people in this room have not, including people who really should have, such as Euros semi-final chairs. But there's some pretty crazy shit in there. I'm gonna bring some screenshots up soon, right? And that's going to change the way we think about debating. It's just kind of sitting there for everyone to read, and that's, mental that anyone can get that advantage by going and reading the judging manual sometime. This we talked about. You can sometimes relate your spec to other examples that work in similar ways and also make a little sense, but are AIB knowledge and not spec, and that way you can get away with a little bit more. And this one genuinely has helped me get away with so much. And I know it sounds insane, but I think it's really helpful. Because what the judging manual basically says is that the average informed voter knows various different headlining things, but they don't have knowledge that's country specific. However, if you think about all the motions that we said about the USA, those are really specific. You need to know about specific politicians within the parties. You need to know about how the system works, how the electoral system works. You want to know about how the governmental system works, different branches of government. And all that stuff gets credited, and any judge who's done a basic amount of judging has credited some of that stuff at some point in their judging career. So all you need to do is say some knowledge about that, about a country that's not the USA, then say, you'd credit me if I were talking about the USA, and the AIB, African Informed Voter, is not country specific, and then boom, you get credited. And I know it sounds dumb as fuck, but it also works, and it's helped me get away with so much stuff, so actually do that. Right. Judging manual things. So, this is what the judging manual says. The ordinary intelligent voter, the source of knowledge you expect from someone who regularly reads but does not memorize the front pages and world section of the major international newspaper in the year leading up to Worlds. This is from the World Judging Manual, obviously adapts a slightly different framework for the Euros one. You just go read that judging manual too if you want to, but it's basically the same in this regard. They don't read technical journals and stuff, but they're a smart person and has knowledge that is broad rather than deep. That's actually quite helpful, because in reality, the average person has knowledge that is not broad, but probably deep on a few different things. The mythical AIV does not actually exist in debating, has knowledge that is broad, and they know a little bit about a lot, which is really, really helpful. Because it means that if you can pass off your knowledge as something that's actually just the basic fundamental stuff on that topic, suddenly they have to believe you, right? Or if you can just say, this has obviously been in the front pages of this major international newspaper in the last year, and actually most judges haven't read most major international newspapers consistently over the last year, then guess what? They suddenly believe you as well. And then you can bring in your spec knowledge, and it's quite helpful. The other thing is, it says that they should be familiar with issues and events that have made international headlines for a sustained period of time. And this is the COVID example, which is interesting because presumably, and I've seen this happen in debates, judges do credit people saying the USA did this and the UK did this. And so there is very much a difference between what the judging manual says and what judges will actually credit. Use that as you will. Sometimes you want to go with what the judging manual says, in which case you can just flag the judging manual and tell judges that they're allowed to look at the judging manual and deal it. It's kind of a grey area, but I think they should be able to, because I think it's stupid if you can't look at the rules on how to judge whilst you're trying to judge, and you can tell judges that too. But then it's quite helpful, and so you can tell them to look at it. Or equally, you can just, scrap and say some other stuff if you don't want to look at the judging manual. But yeah, those are my general thoughts on how you can integrate spec. I think you can get away with more than most people think they can. Any questions on that? We're done.
So this is obviously like a good way to get away with lying as well, right? If a team is saying something that is a lie or is also just true, and you want to disprove that by lying yourself it's back, or by actually bringing it back that is true, how do you disprove another team's claim where they just go, you know about this is true, and say you don't know, how would you go about disproving their spec?
Be a man.
If a team says that there's a land bridge, for example, between two places where there's not land, then what do? So, I mean, the answer is yes, you can just counterclaim. If the judge knows which is correct, they'll probably just be like, okay, well, I'm going to know what's the correct one and say it's AIB knowledge because it saves the headache of whatever. If the judge doesn't know, then that's not necessarily good enough. So at that point, your options are either 1, explain it better than the other team has, 2, be more convincing and like more rappy and male or whatever than the other team, and 3, tell the judge to just Google it and please promise you won't tell the CA if you do. Because, like, genuinely though, if you're speaking against a team and that team makes a claim that is completely false, and you know that that claim is completely false, you should absolutely call them out on it, as long as obviously that false claim is hurting you and not helping you. And then those are kind of the various options available to you. And which one you use, honestly, I think more so than anything else, just depends on the judge and what you think they're willing to buy and to do in response to that, and what kind of judge you think they are. But it can be hard, right? If the judge genuinely doesn't know and if they're not going to be willing to look it up, you just have to try and explain it better. But also just build in contingencies, right? Even if the lie is true, whatever. But also, like, keep pointing out that it's a lie, don't let them get away with it. The more confident you sound, the more likely it is for the judge to believe you, and which can hurt you as much as it helps you. Any other questions on this? Okay, cool. What we're going to do now then is get into the meat of the workshop. We've got about an hour to go. So, first of all, incentives. We're going to chat a little bit about different types of incentives, how you can prove them, and how to think. I think it's as simple as here are some incentives to do a thing, and there are no incentives to not do this thing. Generally, the other bench will give you this, right? The other bench will rebut you, and then you've got a second speaker to compare those two things. If they don't, though, especially if you're in top half against a weak team opposite you, which is actually, in my opinion, the most frustrating position to be in a debate, especially if you're OG and the L is not very good, then it's just like, okay, fine, got more content, I guess. But what you want to do, actually, is come up with these reasons yourself and then weigh them out. And it's not just a thing that people are framing as like preemptive rebuttal. It's also a case of this makes your argument stronger, because it means that you actually explain something in a realistic way. Because when people think about things, they don't just think about the reasons to do a thing, they think about the reasons to do it and the reasons to not do it, and then they compare those things. So be charitable, come up with the absolute best reasons not to do a thing, compare those things, and then you've actually proven incentives in a way that you haven't by just listing off a bunch of reasons, i.e. that exercise that we just did was a load of crap. So, people generally care about lots of different things, right? And then the weighing there is actually quite complicated. So you can think about the extent to which the different things that they care about are impacted by the motion. You can think about the extent to which they care about that thing in the first place. Maybe a thing that they really care about is impacted just a little bit, and so overall that's more important to them. You have these micro debates within the actual debate about this kind of weighing. This often is what benches can come down to. But that's a very important thing that people don't think about, but actually should quite a lot. Okay, cool. We're going to do another quick exercise before we talk about incentives more holistically. Yeah. And then also 6, 7, 8, 9. So, what we're going to do now is, I'm going to give you a motion. I'm then going to give you all, I'll split you into 4 groups. Give each group one sort of sphere of incentives. I want you to come up with one basic incentive that you're trying to cater towards on gov of this motion. I don't want you to bother with proving that incentive, just assume that you reach that impact. Don't prove it. What I want you to do is specifically focus on the most convincing way that you can give for your incentive over other incentives, and then we'll talk about which way works and which way doesn't work and see what we can learn from that. So, this is the motion. This House is the CEO of a major tech company that cease operations in countries that engage in significant censorship of the internet. Okay, so these are the four spheres of influence. What I want us to not do is the thing that people always do in capitalism debate, which is assume that every person and every corporation only wants money and nothing else, and that's all they care about. Because in reality, that's obviously not how the world works, but it's really easy just to fall to that in debating. So let's try and be a bit more nuanced. So what I am going to do is try to split up some of the newer members, because all the newer members are kind of in a corner back there. Actually, okay, let's do to Ryan there on the back. Then we'll do you four plus Zainab and Cyrus. We'll do Esme down to Elishba. We'll do Ayman down to Dawn. So at the back, you're thinking financial. Then you guys, Cyrus to Kate, are doing legal. Esme to Ayman, or Esme to Elishba, whatever I said, ideological. And then you guys are doing public backlash. Take like 5-ish minutes.
I'll be back just to ask people for their
Public backlash is just.
If that's within your.
wing
Guys, it's time. Okay, so we're going to go around the 4 teams. I want someone to briefly, talking like less than 90 seconds, summarize what they talked about, what they think the way is. So, team 1.
Cool. So the basic incentive was, sorry, we did talk about money, but you did assign us financial.
Yeah.
So basically, it's likely that you're not going to get as many people using your service because whatever, we've proven this in some way. So you're not going to make as much money off of ad revenue and people using the service in and of itself. The weighing for that, because the oppositional thing is that maybe this is a really large market and you can move in an unsaturated market to some extent. Adam had a really good explanation here, which is basically that the market is usually quite well saturated in these countries by local developers who are creating their own thing because of the censorship, which means you'd have to compete by cutting prices and stuff. So it's better on our side to just not be in there at all and work in the places that aren't going to limit you in those ways, basically.
Cool. Team 4, do you have any immediate response to that? Let's say you're expanding off them.
Financially, you'd be rich anyway. Like you're a major, you're a major tech company. Whether you get like £1 billion or a bajillion pounds, it doesn't matter. You still have like a yacht at the end of the day, so this isn't really something that you care about that much.
Cool. But anything about the specific lines of analysis that Nora gave?
I wasn't listening.
Well, if you're weighing up your the degree to which your incentive is to evade saturation of market, there's probably a degree to which you're not very evasive of this kind of thing anyway, because if you perceive yourself, like we have a bunch of framing on this, but if you perceive yourself as hyper competitive, which we have reasons for in our incentive, then probably you also perceive yourself as being able to overcome this kind of thing.
I also just think like having to do some amount of competition, it means that you still have more market than no market.
Yeah, I'm not sure I buy this competition thing as well, because with like network economies, then if a few people are in it, then everyone has to be in it. So it means that it's very hard to have like this small individual competition, but also there's not that many fixed costs surrounding that kind of thing.
I mean, the thing I was thinking is just the first thing that Nora said was, you assume you have fewer users and therefore make less money. So what's the problem if you guys are the public backlash team? Fewer users, presumably, you can just say that's the public backlash, right? So then that's the easiest line of weighing you can give. So
I like the other way better though.
Just directly rebuttal.
you should also relate into the line of analysis that they've given and not just the cool stuff you thought was in perhaps time, right? Which is also an important lesson. Okay, what is the cool stuff that you came up with in perhaps time beyond what you've already said?
So-
I'm going to time you were that.
Okay, we have the financially be rich anyway. Legally, you can always dodge it or just succumb to it. Legal procedure is something companies do all the time, they already used to. And ideologically, you're quite malleable and are able to convince yourself whatever suits you in the moment. The reason for this is that your sense of self is defined by what others give of you. We have 4 reasons for this. Firstly is the corporate hierarchy of the tech industry, which is usually defined by one individual person being at the top. This is like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. This means that you are likely someone who is within that corporate hierarchy, and that's how you've laid out your company. Secondly, the corporate culture often reinvigorates this. It elevates the idea of being a bigger and intellectual. You have people calling you a yes man all the time and engaging in that way, but it also means you have like a large fan following of that specific base. Thirdly, this means you often aren't used to failure, and tech industries are often being seen as the future. They're often reveled as something that is uniquely important and something that can give a large benefit. And fourthly, probably comes from startups and education. This means you probably love yourself, particularly care about what other people think of you. What happens when you start engaging within countries that engage in significant censorship? It doesn't even actually matter whether or not it's good or bad for your company. It's just that this is a controversial thing by itself, and this is something that people who are within your base, particularly coming from a Western background, could be seeing something something as you're ideologically giving yourself up, you're not reveling the benefits of the free market anymore, and perhaps you'll have people from the other country who are likely to see you as succumbing to the authoritarian regime and government. This will mean you'll have people rejecting you, calling you out on the street, and the weighing on this is more important because everything else you can always change about your life. But this is the way in which you define yourself, and this is something that weighs upon you every single day and changes how you see your
It's
see your
whether or
family,
not
see
you
your
can look your
friends.
wife in the eyes.
Look your wife in the eyes. This is why backlash is most important because you're an insecure guy.
Cool. Okay.
Run a whole argument in 90 seconds.
Do you think there's any tension between the response that you gave to the ideological stuff and the reasons that you gave for caring about public
Yeah,
backlash stuff?
because we were like, you're ideologically malleable, but also you care about this a lot.
Yeah.
So how do you resolve that? Because I think that's resolvable, right? But how do you resolve
I mean,
that?
I think it is resolvable because you don't care about the backlash because of the cause of the backlash, which is an ideological dispute. You care about the backlash purely because it's an insult to your ego.
Yeah. And then presumably you can also argue that changed the way that other people look at you and perceive you because people are like sheeple, right? And then you can land at the being able to look your wife in the eye stuff as well.
But also, like, you're ideologically malleable, as in, like, if you have some sort of perception, then you can convince yourself later. But if people are constantly shitting on you, then it's hard to do that.
Cool. Okay, so you're allegedly very ideologically malleable. Team 3, what are your thoughts on that?
Their stuff.
Yeah, their stuff and your own stuff.
Yeah, sure. In terms of rebuttal, I guess, I think the first thing is I'm not sure why you are valuable, but particularly if you've come up with a product since its inception and believe that you're able to make a major difference in the world of technology. You believe in your product, you have people who support you and are your hardcore fans, so it's unclear why you're unlikely to compromise the integrity of your product such that you would care about backlash. That's it.
Well, yeah, so we can come up with all of the same things for why you are a massive egotist, because we do think that plays into your own self-ideology. But the impact that you get from them of oh, you're probably, you get massive backlash and insult to you. You're probably so loved at that point that your super fans rally behind you even more they do with you on Musk, right? So I think our point is that you fundamentally believe in your technology. You think it's revolutionary for all of the reasons that they said, and it's also been majorly successful. So that signals that everyone buys into this from the book. And so you want to maintain the integrity of the ideology that you think underlies your product. So the example that we use is Elon Musk and free speech absolutism, right? You're you're more likely to care about this than money because of that you're egotistical and the fact that you're completely unwilling to compromise. But also we can just do some example analysis here where X sacrifices its stock value for absolutist ideology, where they're we're willing to trade that off, that's fine. We're getting their site banned in Brazil because they refuse to follow the rules because that would compromise the image that they have of their own brand. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah. I also think that ideology is one of those things where it's very easy to say ideology is malleable, right? Team 4 really likes to say. But I think you can also explain why those people believe in something, right? Not everyone. But if you can explain the reasons why people believe in something, then it's fairly easy to come back from a fairly glib line of analysis that ideology is malleable. And you can probably make that into a bigger question as well. Good. Okay. Team 2. Legal has been shat on a lot as, you can get out of legal stuff, you have money. What's your way?
Sure. On specifically whether you can get out of it, I think in lots of cases you can't because you're personally liable for the actions of your company as the executive decision maker. But even if you can, a long, drawn-out legal process that's specifically affecting you and your family probably weighs on you just as an individual outside of whatever your company is doing in a really significant everyday way. As in you're always worrying about the overarching legal issues that you're dealing with at that time. And so probably, sure, maybe eventually you get out of it, doesn't make it any nicer as a CEO. You care about the legal implications of what you're doing in the first place, and avoiding that liability really quite a lot. First on some sort of long-termist based view, probably what's in the news cycle, public backlash changes decently soon. Whether you can recover your financial woes may or may not happen. And probably ideologies, even if they aren't malleable, do evolve over time. But if you have some sort of legal blight in your rearview mirror that makes it harder to get future jobs because you're seeing more reliability, it makes your own personal life just more difficult. And so therefore that sort of stays with you forever. There'd be stuff to add.
Cool. Okay, fun. Right. Does anyone have any general thoughts on anything that anyone has said? Without getting into, or X person said this thing, I think that's stupid. But general thoughts on that exercise. We're done.
On the on both the ideology and legal team, I'm unsure why taking part in this action actually does mean it like one fulfills your ideological interest and why you wouldn't be able to build on a comparative. And secondly, on legally, why this is something that is actually going to lead you into legal financial trouble. Why won't you just do this in legal ways?
Yeah, just think of it being comparative. I'll come to Adam.
Just from the legal stuff, from what this house as the CEO and from as the CEO, but from what I understand, usually when companies like break some law or for example break some regulation, usually it's the company as a legal entity sued. I'm not sure why you would care as like CEO of that entity, who still you can probably kind of like think yourself that firstly you yourself are not getting into legal trouble, or usually unless you are for example somehow responsible for like managing the company according to some like treaty, you don't have to pay anything. Plus also from like your view of yourself, you can always like divide the responsibility with maybe like the previous CEOs, maybe like your employees and something like that.
Yeah, I think that hits on another important thing, right? Which is it's important to build in contingencies to your arguments. So if a lot of the weighings hinge on you being personally legally liable, also build in some weighing as to what if we're not going to be able to prove it to that extent, but what if your corporation is legally liable, and have some contingency stuff there for not just your best case, but also future cases. Yeah, I'm in.
I think like the other three that aren't public backlash notably have contingencies which have to be circumstantially proven to a greater extent than the public backlash stuff, because all our arguments are just like really stock. So like, which then like could bite us, right? Because like we're really stock and it could be really boring, and then they're like, it's not true that ubiquitously that CEOs are like this. But then like also then like the others have a higher burden on like the circumstance.
Right, there are a lot of hands up. I have other stuff that I want to get through. Does anyone have a really burning point that I think is going to be very helpful for other people to hear? Cool, now we're going to move on. Right, so hopefully that was helpful. The point of that was to get you thinking about different types of incentives, and just most importantly to think about comparing yours against others, right? Because I think that the lines that made the most sense there and were attacked the least, well, the ones that made the most sense and like stood the most were the ones that compared their ideas against some other ideas. You've got a bunch of different incentives, you've got to have that in a debate. And sometimes it's not just about disproving the others, but trying to weigh over them, especially if you're using the new, rebutting your own rules. So, question: how can incentives still have an impact on outcome, even if they're overrun by other more important incentives? Basically, what if you kind of care about something, you care about other things more, and it's unclear as to how that thing is going to be influential?
Can I ask you about the last slide?
Sure.
So, for like lots of our responses to all the other things, someone could interpret them as rebuttal. So like what Adam said about how like legally most times CEOs aren't the ones who are liable as the company, that's rebuttal, right? But that's in the form of weighing on the bench.
Yeah.
So what is like pure weighing in this sense?
So the
Because
difference
also,
is,
like,
if you're a smart team doing that as rebuttal, what you're going to say is usually CEOs aren't liable, and here are the reasons why they're not liable. If you're doing that as weighing, what you're going to say is opening to prove why CEOs are liable, so that's a gap in their speech, which is a thing that the judge should be noticing independently, and that should harm the persuasiveness of their speech because it's a flaw in their arguments on the speaker scale, and so you're just pointing that out to the judge. So the actual difference is between pointing out what they've not done and explaining what that means for the conclusions that you draw from their premises, versus explaining why the premise that they've missed out actually goes the other way, which would likely be a rebuttal.
Why is that not just framing? Like, can you not just stand up and say this is not how legally things work, and that's just framing the world?
It depends on the extent to which you're contradicting them, first of all, and then it depends on the extent to which you're right.
You should just
you're
say
allowed
it doesn't happen sometimes.
So the stop stuff stands, right? So this will happen sometimes, this is an even if, we buy into OO's conception of the motion, whatever. That stuff all works too.
But lots of weighing is also just mitigation, right? In general. So like
Yeah.
your stuff with like sometimes it doesn't stand is literally just mitigation.
Yeah, but you can, but
Yeah,
what,
depending
what
on
you
where
do
you are,
is you're
those
not,
particular
but there's a
instances.
difference between offensive mitigation, which
Yeah.
is you're going to give a bunch of reasons as to why something's not often true, and just pointing out as an observer would, as a judgment, right? If it's fair for a judge to point out, actually, I don't think they've proven this in very many circumstances, they only occur like 10% of the time, it is probably fair for you as an extension speaker to point that out. If it would be insertionary for a judge to say that, it's a line of rebuttal, it's probably rebuttal for the extension speaker to say that too. Yeah.
So lots of judges aren't very good.
Yes.
Including sometimes me. So sometimes judges aren't going to think that there is a burden for a case, i.e. the legal thing, right?
Yeah.
For them to be able to prove that. So how do you show the judge that that should be a burden which they prove if you're like, fuck, they haven't really realised?
You just explain that.
Is that not giving reasons why?
No, because what you do is, right, you basically say, in order for this argument to stand, so you say, opening government's done a bunch of work to prove why, if you as an individual are held legally liable, it's something you should care about a lot. In order for this to stand, they would have needed to prove why you as an individual would be likely to be held legally liable.
Oh,
Otherwise,
that's
it's
important.
unclear as to why these impacts come about. We're not going to argue this doesn't happen, because that would be rebuttal. But we would point out that OG's not really explained why it would happen, and so it's very hard to credit their impacts, because you just don't know how often that happens.
Sure.
On the contrary, we're going to prove why our impacts happen lots of the time, and therefore we're going to beat them uncertainty.
Okay.
And that's how you would do that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. What?
We're just
That was
fans.
beautiful.
Oh, thanks. Okay, so, question. This thing that I talked about before. So, intuition pump. Anyone tell me, what are a couple differences between someone doing a comp because they're excited to do it and someone doing it when they're really reluctant and don't actually want to? Like, in terms of how they act and go about the comp. What are some differences? I know that some of you have spec on this from recent competitions. Nora.
I don't know, an excited person after a round where they don't do badly might be able to spring back more easily because they're happy to be there, whereas someone reluctantly doing one might be like, I wish I weren't doing this at all.
Yeah, brilliant. Cyrus.
Whether they ask for feedback after a round.
Yeah, for sure. We're down.
But surely both of these you could still do reluctantly. Like, wouldn't like the actual difference be like the way in which you present yourself and how like happy you are? Like, because surely the actions of doing a comp you can always just. No, but it's true. Right? You can reluctantly ask for feedback. It's like I do a comp, I gotta do it anyway. But it's more just about how like your frame of mind is going into the comp and how happy you are and how much you tell people that like.
Sure.
Everything.
Some things
are
on
more
the
likely.
quick question exercise. Go on.
Being excessively contrarian.
Ellie.
The amount of pressure you put on your partner kind of implicitly, because if you're really excited about it, then it like you just do things that make things easier. Whenever you're reluctant, you just don't think of the things that you ought to do in order to make a partnership easier.
Yeah. Kate.
I think there are different levels of reluctance, right? Because maybe somebody who's going into a comp and who bombs, who didn't care about it before, is like, oh fuck, I shouldn't have been here. But on the opposite, I feel like somebody who's really excited for a comp who fails is going to be quite upset, whereas somebody who's just doing it just because might actually take their wins and their losses more casually.
Good. Ryan.
Yeah, so all for that, I just think there's a big difference in expectation, and then that can probably be applied to each of the examples and result in the outcomes identified.
Okay. So all fun method debate conversation, but also proves the point, right? Which is that actually the extent of incentives also matters. And so it's not just a case of either when you're making an argument or rebuffing it, that an incentive is proven or the incentive is not proven, and therefore we cannot reach our conclusions. But it's also a case of how those conclusions come about. And this idea is applicable to pretty much any kind of scenario in which you're trying to prove these things is anyway. So basically just think about that and think about how that influences the conclusions that you're going to draw. So have varying levels of incentives, link them to different levels of impacts, right? So if your impact is a company's going to improve working conditions, then there's a difference in terms of why they're doing that, right? Is it that they're going to do it and they're going to do it very minimally, very tokenistically? In which case, that's going to be the worst case of your argument, but you still want to impact that out properly, because then if that's what your argument is reduced to and that's all you're left with, you have something as opposed to nothing. Whereas if you only impact the best case, you have nothing and that gets taken out. Maybe it happens with some effort, maybe it becomes really prioritized above other things, right? And you should map out all these different things and explicitly say, this is if you buy our incentives a lot, a little, a medium amount, whatever. Because then you have something, right? And then, especially if you're an opening team, you're not just contingent your best case lasting for the next 45 minutes of the debate, but you actually have contingencies built in. Cool. This one here is really important. What about irrationality? Fun little meme for the math nerds in the room. So, irrationality, really important. People generally aren't very good at using this in debates, I think. Because what people generally say is, oh, but they assume rationality, and they're not rational. Okay, but what does that mean, right? Because actually, rationality is fake. No one's rational. No one in this room is rational. Everyone has irrational things that they do and that they think about. Even fucking Spock, who's like the pinnacle or the paragon of rationality, is clearly not rational and is influenced by emotions. And that's, the whole point of Spock's character arc. So actually, just standing up and saying someone's irrational doesn't mean anything. If you want to think about irrationality, which you should do both when you're arguing for someone being rational and someone being irrational, think about the ways in which they're irrational. What are the things that make them irrational, and what does it actually mean? And do you mean proper like irrationality, as in they cannot link logical conclusions together and draw premises to their conclusions? Or do you mean like there's another thing that they care about? And I think that's irrational, because I don't think that you should care about love or friendship. But actually this person does care about that, and so it's rational to them, and they're still capable of rational thought, but that rational thought maybe just doesn't agree with what your rational thought would be. So, is it ego? Is it lack of information? How does the cause of the irrationality actually affect the actor? This is another quite important thing which does come up. Just try to think a little bit more nuanced when you think about irrationality, because actually, with the way that most teams base it, it's pretty easy to beat. Okay. Yes, this is the other thing. Irrationality is often decision specific. This is also a thing with like capacity in medicine, right? But if you just think intuitively about a person who has like late stage dementia, they probably are not capable of deciding what to do with all their family finances, and so that should go to whoever has power of attorney. But they probably are capable of deciding if they want to wear a blue shirt or a pink shirt on that particular day. And so just like capacity is decision specific, so is irrationality. Okay, very good. Right, we're going to talk a bit about capacity now. Anything that anyone wants to add before that? Brilliant. Okay, so first things first, we're going to think a little bit about basically what we did with the incentive exercise, and ask yourselves, what are some obstacles to a thing happening? And basically make the same point again, because I think it's an important point. So, what are some reasons why it'd be really hard for Trump to run in 2028 if he loses in 2024? We're just going to go in reverse order. I want everyone to give me one quick reason. So, Dom.
Should probably be in jail.
We're down.
He could be dead.
Right.
His,
Very likely.
his ego might be smashed.
Hard to get people to fund you when you keep losing.
MAGA realized they're crazy.
Your voter base is less confident in you and wants to support you for another election.
Why?
Just a couple of backlash again.
He's so old.
Other people in the party want to run.
Harris does so well, it's tougher.
Okay, what's your new one?
I don't know, like, I don't know why else he would, but I feel like everyone said it, like,
Alright.
She's got to go different reasons.
I mean, JD Vance is probably going to take over this.
His demographic event is ages out and dies. Okay, fair enough, there were other last year, right?
Maybe if he's, by that time we'll have lost twice, then I don't know, and then the Republican Party isn't even going to nominate him anymore because they do want to win at some point.
A lot of his money comes from his idiot voters buying his weird merch, and they'll probably stop doing that if he sucks.
He's probably very much lost the capacity to do normal Trump things and have cognitive ability to debate and such.
Normal Trump things is such a fun oxymoron. Interesting.
A greater degree of exhaustion with like populist rhetoric and people desiring for their candidate to have an actual policy platform that they're running on.
Yeah.
It would be hard for you to attract like any staff, campaign managers, any like campaign staff when you cannot provide them with any like public jobs or with any promise of like nominating.
Yeah.
People like to campaign on a return to normalcy. The weird shit is all his fault.
I think it's like an extra 4 years of people making, like, undermining the validity of his values and what he stands for, so loss of momentum, less people believe in you, etc.
Good. Well done, everyone, except Zainab. Zainab, if you ever start, just believe in yourself, and crucially, don't stop believing. Yeah, okay. So, yes, the key pitfall that I think a lot of people have is they just assume capacity, or they assume that someone recognizes their own capacity, and that's just a thing that they can do, and people are exactly as capacitous as they realize. I think the second one's bigger, right? Especially in good debates, people do tend to prove capacity and pick up on it if we don't. But what I don't think people actually think about is the fact that, like, maybe you don't recognize how good you are at doing something, and you don't recognize how capable you are at doing something, and that perception of capacity mismatch is actually quite important for a lot of different decisions. So I think in general people in debates are good at explaining external factors that limit your capacity, right? External things that stop you from doing something, but not so much the psychology. And understanding psychology is really, really important. Case file psychology is one of the things that I think Tara said was most helpful for her in terms of achieving a lot of her success. And I think it's actually quite clear to see why, because psychology and why people do the things that they do is impactful in pretty much any debate. So, how good are actors really recognizing their capacity? Because there are a lot of different types of biases, and in most debates that I watch, this basically stands to the point of optimism bias, pessimism bias, optimism bias, oh! And you don't want to explain. It's like, okay, fine, some people can have those sometimes, but like, why? Yeah, that's not analysis, fuck you if you do that. So, what are some other biases that we can have? I'm not going to explain them right now, because we're going to do a thing with them in a second. But these are all various different examples, right? So you've got, actually we'll explain them briefly. So Dunning-Kruger effect, the people who think that they know the most about a thing are the people who know the most about it, and the people who know the least about it, because the people who know the least don't realize how much there is to know, how much in depth they are. Whereas the people who know a medium amount know enough to know that they don't know very much. Self-serving bias. This is, if I do something good, then if something good happens to me, it's because of all the good things that I've done, and I deserve that success, and I made it happen. Whereas if something bad happens to me, then it's not my fault. If I first that debate, it's because I'm super awesome and good at debating, and if I'm fourth, it's because the judge is absolute dog shit. Confirmation bias. You believe that a thing will happen, you look for evidence to back up the thing that you believed. Sunk cost fallacy. Essentially, you want to keep doing a thing, because if you keep doing a thing, then you believe that whatever you invest into that thing in the first place was a lot of waste. If you book a plane ticket, and then you decide that actually going on that trip would be net bad for you, you really don't want to do it, you go anyway, because if not, the plane ticket was a waste, is the fallacy, right? The plane ticket's been bought either way, the money's gone, do whatever's going to make you happiest, even if that's abandoning the plane ticket. And then either action bias, you don't like the status quo, you want to do something, anything, or status quo bias. The status quo is safe and comfortable. So, right. Importantly, not everyone has the same biases, and not everyone just suffers from stock biases, because the reasons why people develop these biases are different and nuanced, and contingent on the individual factors that affect that person. So the question that you want to ask yourself whenever you're explaining a bias is, what biases does this person have? What are the reasons why they have this bias? And are those reasons generic reasons that I'm giving as to why anyone may or may not have this bias? Or are they specific as to why this particular actor suffers from this particular bias, right? Along those lines, this is another one of my pet peeves in debating, is people say, they're experts, they know what they're doing, they obviously have perfect capacity. Dude, think about any government, any corporation, any smart person, any expert, how perfect are they? They're not.
Doctor?
What's that?
Any doctor?
Exactly, right? No one's perfect, no one has perfect capacity ever for anything, and actually sometimes people assume that they do. And it's just the biggest pile of crap in debating to say, well, it's not the biggest, there are much bigger ones, but it's a big pile of crap in debating, and to say they're experts, they know what they're doing. Because we all know better than that, and in whatever field of expertise we all individually have in our degrees, we all obviously know that that's not the case. So, quick exercise. Biases. These are the ones we just talked about. I want people to, Cyrus?
Sorry, this is a question from a couple of slides ago, but it's a question I didn't realize I had, and then somebody did. On the difference between capacity and incentive, if you had asked this exact same question, but saying everyone give one reason why Trump wouldn't want to run in 2028, lose in 2024, many of the reasons would have been identical.
Yeah.
So how do you differentiate then why Trump doesn't want to run and why Trump can't run when those reasons are similar?
Yeah, that's a fair question. So a lot of the stuff that people gave were probably just incentives. They're not things that actually stop him from running. Some of the things are things that stop him from running. But there's also overlap, right? So sometimes you're stopped by the fact that you don't want to do anything, and that does then limit your capacity. So incentives and capacity actually feed into each other. So on the one hand, if you don't want to do something, that often, but not always, stops you from doing a thing, you need to prove why that is actually a limiting factor. And then equally, if you're able to do a thing, that can make you want to do that thing more, and you might be biased or towards thinking that the things that you can do are better, and justifying to yourself why those things are good based on your capacity as well to make you feel better about it. So actually there's a lot of overlap, and they're not really two distinct things. The original meme that I had at the start was incentives capacity with the Spider-Man pointing. I changed it because I thought that the one that I put up was more useful, but I think that incentives capacity Spider-Man pointing also kind of works, to be honest. Okay, so we have 4 groups. We're just going to stick in those groups so I don't have to break you up again. Each group pick one. Try not to pick the same as other groups. I know you have no control over that, just like be psychic or whatever. Pick an actor, any actor, in any context, and then explain why they have one of these biases, just to get us thinking about how to actually do that. We'll give you a couple minutes for this.
Is it same groups?
What is action?
Yeah, same groups.
Action is the opposite of status quo bias.
It's like making more highways.
What, one more lane?
Yeah.
I'm in. So it starts like half past?
25. Actually, the nice servitor is in, so maybe not.
I think the Dunning-Kruger effect is slightly different, which is like,
So we're thinking of like an anti-vax or anti-mom, that she has the Dunning-Kruger effect, because she probably has some information about vaccines, so, but she doesn't have all of them, so she feels like an expert even though she's not. There's also other biases here, like a confirmation bias, that once she has this initial bias, she's going to look for more and more information that confirms her feeling that vaccines are wrong.
Yeah. Good. I suppose one of the reasons for the Dunning-Kruger effect there is if you're consistently told that actually you have lots of information, it's not as complicated as people make it seem, and the experts are all wrong, and if you do your own research, then you can become an expert yourself. That limits the extent to which you think there is lots of information out there, so you can believe that you're an expert without knowing very much about it. So yeah, I think it's a very good example. Cool. Team 3.
So we chose the government and sunk cost. So we said that government's often bound by what their electorates want, and the electorate knows they give the government their hard-earned money, and this is really quite unpopular. No one actually likes paying taxes. So because their electorate expects the government to take an investment and then continue on and have that materialize into profit, the government suffers an extra sunk cost fallacy, because they know that if they give up on a project that they have spent money on in the past, not only is it going to feel like a waste to their advisors, their entire population is going to hold them accountable for this and be upset about it, because their population is also bound by this same bias, right? And then you see things like HS2, right, where the government does give up on a project of high-speed rail, but that is at the point at which it was so wasteful it genuinely wasn't able to continue. But if they hadn't suffered from this bias, they would have given up on it a lot earlier, because you can usually tell that a project is going to be unsuccessful kind of early on. Yeah.
Nice. That's really good. 84 analysis.
Yes,
Yeah, nice. Cool. Team 4.
We had the 2008 Conservatives. So notably, just any party that goes from being opposition to government generally has a self-serving bias. Insofar as, for example, the 2008 Tories were like, the financial crashes, all your fault, to get into government, and then to explain things like austerity and mishandling, they're like, this is not our fault, we can't control this. So often just any government that ends up in government, previously has to attract people by saying it's their fault, and then claim it's no longer their fault once they're in there. Coercion.
Yeah, any government is explaining how things happen in relation to an opposition party or a party they're in coalition with all the time. Yeah, good. Team 1.
So we did Elon Musk and purchasing Twitter with some cost fallacy.
Nice.
And he's shown throughout his career that he's someone who cares very much about the public perception of him. He wants to be seen as a genius, and because of that, he has a history of making incredibly large promises that, despite failing at in the time frame he gives, he keeps re-promising. And with Twitter, he promised to purchase it because of his free speech platform, and in his mind, staked his reputation on it. And so despite there being litigation after litigation where he probably could have backed out or not paid a ridiculously overpriced share value, he kept going because it felt backing out would have been too damaging.
Yeah, really good. Actually, really similar to what Esme said there as well, in terms of the ripple effect, in terms of how other people's biases then force you into something. Yeah, I like that. Go on, were you about to say something?
Oh, it was just if no one else had an action bias, we also had an action bias, because it hasn't been mentioned yet.
Fair. I think we might just move on in the interest of time.
But it's the disillusion budget.
All of these biases make you do something. Almost all of them, at least. Maybe not Dunning-Kruger, I don't know. Or they make you think you're more capable than you actually are. Are there any biases, names, or anything that make you think you're less capable than you actually are, other than pessimism bias?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, status quo bias as well is very much one of them from the last slide. Dunning-Kruger effects can go both ways. Confirmation bias can go both ways. You can also have the imposter syndrome, so you think you're less capable than you actually are. You can have basically the other side of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is that as you get into the middle and actually do know something, you sometimes think that you know less than you actually do, because you're so overwhelmed with all the stuff that you don't know, which then can also cause the imposter syndrome as well. There are probably other names for other ones. I don't know if anyone else has better answers to that. Yeah, but like the point is, there are loads and loads of psychological and other biases out there. This is just a small selection of them. I think understanding different biases is probably a pretty good idea, and for people who are doing majors or whatever, I mean, case filing for them is quite a valuable thing to case file.
Where can we find them?
Just Google it.
The psychological thing.
A classic negative bias that like I think everyone's used in the debate before is like the one of minorities and not wanting to go into government, not wanting to go into specific positions, or like even like women not wanting to speak up because they haven't represented those things. Just like the way in which society makes you think in a specific way that make you feel as if you don't want to do this stuff. So like
you can probably call that. You can also make cool names up stuff, right? You call it like the bias of overwhelming odds. It's like when David and I did no notes and I made up this cool name for economic concept and I called it like I don't know what I called it. It was shell something. It made no sense. It was awesome though. If the judges are watching, I promise it made sense. Right. Cool. Yes. Anyway, and then similarly to incentives, there's a sliding scale of capacity, building contingencies by having various levels. Yeah, this is the scale from human being to word app. So yeah. Like with the example we did before, there are also probably external factors to limit the capacity of the CEO to change the culture of a company, and so, you know, to whatever extent their capacity is limited, even if they can't do very much, impact why that still matters. If they can do loads, impact that. We've got a best case afterwards. Okay. What we're gonna do now, right, and you all know it. Let's talk a little bit about how to weigh and compare these different things. So, how do you weigh incentives and capacity against each other? Right, I'm going to first of all bust some myths, right, just really sarcastically. Opening proved incentives and we proved capacity is not an automatic win, because then you also only have half of an argument. And if the rules were reversed and you were at opening and they were in closing, they would just claim the opposite and it would be equally effective. And so it means nothing. We take a higher burden or a lower burden is not an auto victory, because it only matters if there's a reason why, say you're taking a higher burden, maybe the higher burden actually matters in relation to the opposite, or if you're taking a lower burden, because they've not actually met their higher burden. But if you take a lower burden, and their higher burden is completely proven, it doesn't matter that you're taking a lower burden, that doesn't help you win, it's just pointing something out. No reason why you win with that. We don't rely on the specific line of analysis that they do. It's also not an auto victory if that line of analysis is proven. Yeah, all these different things are relative, as are incentives and capacity. So, the important thing to remember actually is that weighing incentives and capacity against each other isn't just like a stock thing that you do in the way that's become stock for weighing utilitarianism and deontology. There is stock that you can do, but largely it just depends on the extent to which they're both proven and the extent to which you've been able to have tasked out of them. And if you can argue that you've proven your thing better, then that often is just going to be what actually matters. Because none of these things is ever absolute. You never have absolute capacity or absolute percentage towards one thing. It'd be very, very rare. And so similarly, people will sometimes do a thing because it's easier, right? Or because it's more certain, even if there is less incentive. That's what I was saying before in response to the questions as well. So the actual thing that we want to think about then is a couple things. One, generally just be quite specific. So tailor your way to the actual scenario at hand. And then you're less likely to be lazy, more likely to actually think of lines of analysis. And then also be comparative. And this ties into the whole point that we've been making, the point we made in exercise 1 as well, which is what's the alternative and how desired or possible is that alternative. So I'm not going to stand up here and give you a bunch of generic lines of weighing for incentives versus capacity and vice versa, because you probably know them. And also, like, they're generic and boring and encourage laziness. What I'm going to tell you to do is think about being comparative, think about the extent to which they're both proven, think about being specific, and kind of the things that we've talked about in the exercises so far. So, we'll do one last exercise, and then devastatingly I'm going to have to miss the fun other part of this workshop that I wanted to do, which was how to prove your goddamn burdens. But that can wait till another time. So, what we're going to do is combine teams 1 and 4 on this side, combine teams 2 and 3 on this side, and then there's a new guy who's showing up at the back. You can join teams 2 and 3 if you would like to. Yes. And we're just going to do a tag team battle. So what I'm going to do is give you a motion. I'm going to give team 1 a stance. I'm going to give team 2 a stance. And then I want you to both line up against each other. On team 1, someone's going to say a line of weighing and go to the back of the queue. On team 2, someone's going to counter with another line of weighing, go to the back of the queue. I'm going to keep going until one of the teams has run out of things to say. So, you guys line up, think about how you want to play it strategically, and then I'll give you the votes.